The stock of the rifle was cracked, split along the walnut grain somewhere in the Vosges, in cold that turned metal brittle and men quiet. No replacement parts. There hadn't been since Anzio. He'd stripped copper wire from a farmhouse wall, twisted it around the break with pliers borrowed from a dead man's kit. The wood held. Not because the repair was good, because it didn't have a choice. 20 pounds of steel, cracked walnut, and stolen wire. One man was moving through the mud, not running, hunting. He carried a Browning automatic rifle, a BAR, 9 kilos, 20 pounds of steel and walnut. He had 3 magazines left, maybe 4. Ahead of him, a German machine gun nest, an MG-42 Zipper, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. The math was simple. One man, limited ammo. Nay, versus a fortified position that had already chewed up 2 squads. By all logic, he should have waited for the tanks. He should have waited for the mortars. He didn't. He stood up, he walked forward, and he did something that doesn't make sense in any manual you'll ever read. He didn't fire, he yelled. Is a bluff only madness if it fails? This isn't a story about strategy. Strategy is what generals do with maps and coffee in a warm tent. This is about what happens when the maps are wrong and the coffee is frozen. It's about Technical Sergeant Llewellyn Chilson. You might not know the name, you know Audie Murphy, you know Sergeant York. But Chilson, he's the ghost in the machine, the second most decorated soldier of the war, yet somehow he slipped through the cracks of history. We're going to talk about a specific 48-hour period in the spring of 1945, a period where the German army was collapsing, but, and this is critical, a dying animal is most dangerous right before the end. This is the story of how one man dismantled a German defensive line. Not with air support, not with a tank, but with a rifle that, by the end of it, was completely empty. To understand what happened in that muddy field, you have to look at the board. March 1945, the Western Front. The U.S. 7th Army was pushing into the heart of Germany. The 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, were the tip of the spear. These men were tired. They had fought through Sicily. They had fought through Anzio. They had fought through southern France. 500 days of combat. You know, if you've watched our episode on Lanzerath Ridge, specifically the I&R platoon under Lieutenant Boak, you know what exhausted men can do when they have no choice. At Lanzerath, 18 men held off 500 paratroopers through sheer discipline and terrain management. They had ammo, they had a ridge, and they had a plan. Chilson didn't have a ridge. He didn't have a plan. He was operating on instinct. The 45th was crossing the Rhine near a town called Gernsheim. The intelligence reports said the resistance would be light to moderate. That's a phrase veterans hate. Moderate resistance just means the guy typing the report isn't the one getting shot at. The reality was different. The German units here weren't the elite SS formations of the Bulge. They were a mix, old men, boys, fragmented units. But they had something dangerous, desperation. And they had the terrain, concrete bunkers, trenches dug into the tree lines, flak guns leveled for ground combat, the 20mm Flakvierling 38, 4 barrels, designed to shoot down aircraft. When you point it at infantry, it doesn't wound you, it erases you. Chilson's platoon was pinned down 0900 hours. The advance stopped. The mud was sucking the boots off the men. The fire was coming from 3 directions. The lieutenant was trying to get coordinates for the mortars, but the radio was static. This is the moment where most battles stall. The friction of war takes over. Everyone puts their head down and waits for the heavy stuff to clear the way. Chilson didn't wait. He looked at the terrain. He saw the fire lanes. He realized something the others hadn't. The Germans weren't coordinating. They were firing blind, reacting to noise. He turned to his assistant gunner. "Give me the ammo." "All of it?" "All of it." He took the bandoliers. He checked his bar. The copper wire was still holding the stock together. His thumb found the ridge of it without looking, the way you'd find a scar on your own skin. He stepped out of the defilade and started running, not away from the fire, into it. The first engagement happened fast. Chilson flanked right. He used the drainage ditches. Classic infantry tactics. He came up on the blind side of a German sentry post. 3 soldiers. They were looking the wrong way. They were watching the main body of the American force, waiting for the tanks. They never heard the guy covered in mud coming up the drainage pipe. Chilson didn't fire. He didn't want to give away his position yet. He used a grenade. The explosion cracked the morning air. Before the smoke cleared, Chilson was over the lip of the trench. It was close quarters, brutal. He killed 2. The 3rd surrendered. But here's the thing. Chilson didn't stop to secure the prisoner. He didn't stop to wait for his squad to catch up. He kept moving. He knew something about momentum. Violence has a speed. If you move faster than the enemy can process, you become a ghost. You become 10 men instead of 1. He hit the second position at 0920 hours, a machine gun nest. MG-42. This time they saw him. The tracers ripped the air around him. The zip, zip, zip of 7.92 millimeters rounds cutting through the brush. Chilson dropped. He crawled. He was 40 meters, 44 yards out. He raised the BAR. The Browning automatic rifle is a heavy beast, but it's accurate. Chilson fired a burst. The gunner slumped. The loader tried to take the gun. Chilson fired again. Silence. He ran forward. He jumped into the hole. 7 Germans were in the dugout behind the gun. 7. Chilson stood there, smoke rising from the barrel of the BAR, copper wire catching the light where the mud had worn through on the stock. He yelled at them in broken German, or maybe just shouted. It doesn't matter what the words were. The intent was clear. Drop it. They looked at him. 1 American, covered in filth, eyes wide. They looked at their dead gunner. They dropped their rifles. Chilson waved his arm back toward the American lines. Go! He sent 7 prisoners walking back across the field, unguarded. He reloaded. He had 2 magazines left. This is where the story usually ends. The hero does his part, the unit advances, everyone goes home, but the day wasn't over. The main obstacle was still ahead. The town itself, Neuburg. The Germans had fortified the houses. Sniper nests in the attics, anti-tank guns in the basements. Chilson's platoon was taking casualties. 1,400 hours. The sun was trying to break through the overcast, but the smoke was too thick. Chilson was out in front again. He was serving as a forward observer, scouting targets. But he ran into trouble. A 20-millimeter flak gun, the 4-barreled nightmare I mentioned earlier. It was positioned at the end of a street, locking down the entire advance. It fired. The cobblestones exploded. Chilson dove into a doorway. He was pinned. He couldn't go back. He couldn't go forward. He checked his pouches. 1 magazine, 20 rounds. That's 2 seconds of sustained fire. He had a choice. Stay put and wait for nightfall. Or try something stupid. He chose stupid. He waited for the gun to traverse. The moment the barrel swung left to engage a squad down the street, Chilson moved. He sprinted. He didn't fire. He couldn't afford to miss. He closed the distance. 50 meters, 30 meters. The German crew spotted him. They started to crank the traverse handles, trying to swing the quad barrels back to the right. It's a race. A mechanical race. Gears turning versus legs pumping. Chilson won. He got within grenade range. He threw a white phosphorus grenade. Willie Pete, it burns at 2,700 degrees Celsius, 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It creates a cloud of choking white smoke. The gun crew panicked. They couldn't see. They couldn't breathe. Chilson stepped through the smoke. He fired his last magazine, short, controlled bursts. 1, 2, 3. The gun fell silent, but now he was empty. And this is the moment. The bluff? Here it is. Chilson is standing in the middle of a German street. His bar is empty. He has a .45 pistol, but the slide is back. Empty. He hears boots, a lot of boots, coming out of a courtyard to his left. A full German infantry squad. Maybe 20 men. They had heard the fighting. They were coming to reinforce the flak gun. They saw Chilson. Chilson saw them. He was alone. He had no ammo. He was standing in the open. Historically, this is where you surrender. This is where you put your hands up and hope they follow the Geneva Convention. Chilson didn't put his hands up. He raised his empty rifle. His palm settled over the copper wire, the crack in the stock, the thing that shouldn't have held together this long and had. He pointed it directly at the German officer leading the squad. He didn't flinch. He didn't look like a man who was out of bullets. He looked like a man who was bored of killing. He shouted. He pointed to the dead crew on the flak gun. He pointed to the smoke. And then he pointed at the officer. It was a gamble on human psychology. The German officer looked at the carnage. He looked at the burning vehicle. He looked at this lone American who seemed completely unconcerned with the 20 rifles pointed at him. The officer's mind filled in the blanks. If he's this confident, he's not alone. There must be a tank around the corner. There must be a machine gun trained on us right now. The fear of the unseen is stronger than the reality of the scene. The officer slowly unbuckled his pistol belt. He dropped it on the cobblestones. One by one, the German soldiers behind him lowered their Mausers. Chilson kept the empty bar leveled at them. He waved them forward. He marched 20 armed Germans back to the American lines with a rifle that was nothing more than a metal club. Steel, walnut, and copper wire from a farmhouse he couldn't remember the name of. The reports from that day are chaotic. When Chilson finally walked back into the command post, he looked like he'd been dragged behind a truck. He handed over the prisoners. The lieutenant looked at him. "Where's your squad, Sergeant?" "Back there, sir." "Who helped you take the flak gun?" "Just me." Sir." "And these prisoners?" "They decided to come along." The numbers didn't make sense. In the span of about 4 hours, Chilson had killed or wounded an estimated 40 enemy soldiers. He had captured over 40 more. He had knocked out 2 heavy machine guns and a 20-millimeter flak cannon. 80 men. Taken out of the war. By one NCO. The casualty report for Chilson's action? 0. He hadn't even been scratched. If this story sounds impossible, you're not alone. The command staff didn't believe it either, until they saw the prisoners, until they saw the gun positions. The survivors from Chilson's platoon, the ones who watched him run into the smoke, they didn't say much. There's a kind of silence that comes after seeing something like that. You realize that the line between a hero and a casualty is razor thin. If that German officer had called the bluff, if one soldier had pulled a trigger, Chilson would have been just another body in the street. 40 men. Most of their names aren't in any book you'll find. Neither was Chilson's. For decades. The men who do things like this don't lobby for recognition. They just fade into the filing cabinets. A like is the only thing standing between this story and the same fate. A subscribe means the next one gets the same chance. The prisoners were marched to the rear cages. Chilson grabbed a sandwich and reloaded his magazines. Why does this matter? Why do we focus on one sergeant in a war that involved millions? Because it tells us something about the end of the Third Reich. By 1945, the Wehrmacht was broken, not just in terms of tanks and fuel, but in terms of belief. So the German officer who surrendered to an empty rifle didn't surrender because he was a coward. He surrendered because the myth of German invincibility was gone. He surrendered because when he looked at Chilson, he didn't see a soldier. He saw the inevitable. Chilson represented a force that just wouldn't stop. If he had been facing the SS in 1941, that bluff gets him killed. But in 1945, it worked. There is a postscript to this, a strange one. Llewellyn Chilson survived the war. He went home. But the paperwork got lost, or delayed, or stuck in the bureaucracy of the War Department. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. 3 of them, actually. But the big one? The Medal of Honor? It never came. Truman personally pinned 7 decorations on Chilson's chest in a ceremony at the White House in 1946. 7 medals in one day. Chilson stood there, quiet, humble. He didn't ask for the Medal of Honor. He didn't complain. But historians have argued for decades that the Army simply couldn't believe the reports. They thought the numbers were inflated. They thought, no one man does all that. It took years for the full picture to be accepted. The irony is tragic. The very thing that made his actions legendary, the sheer scale of the impossibility, was the reason he was denied the highest recognition. Some of you are watching from the places we're describing. If you're near the Rhine, or if your family has a connection to the 45th Division, let us know in the comments. We're always curious who's listening. Chilson passed away in 1981. He died while shaking hands with veterans at a reunion. He never got the Medal of Honor, and the bar was tagged and boxed after the war. 20 pounds of steel, walnut, and a twist of copper wire from a house that probably isn't standing anymore. They sent it to a warehouse. They never fixed the stock. But somewhere in the archives of the 45th Division, there is a combat report from March 1945. It lists the ammunition expenditure for the platoon. And next to Chilson's name for the final engagement of the day, the column for rounds fired is blank. Because he didn't fire a shot, he just looked them in the eye, and they blinked.